I've been working on urban soils for a long time, and one of the things that distinguishes this work is that we're only working in the very top 2 to 3 centimeters of the soil surface. And this has given us a unique view of the surface that children are playing in. And I will provide a little overview of 2 different cultures and their activities in terms of what happens to the soil with those activities. And New Orleans and Oslo turn out to be very similar in terms of their land areas and similar in terms of their populations. And so I've been working with the Norwegian government, their soils, it isn't soil, it's a geological survey. And I will then provide some information about that. Now, we have had some hint that maybe there's a big problem in the United States, especially. And this came from Clara Patterson, who certainly wasn't strictly a soil scientist, but he certainly knew an enormous amount about lead. Lead was entered into some of his the work that he was doing. He was the scientist who came up with the way of measuring the geologic and geologically coming up with the age of the Earth. So he noticed and suggested that sometime in the near future, and of course now it's the near future of his near future, is that older urban areas of the United States have been rendered more or less uninhabitable by the millions of tons of poisonous industrial lead residue that have accumulated in cities during the past century. And so I will show you a little bit of what we've learned in New Orleans. Okay, now the cultural practices in a city have an enormous amount of influence on the layer, the top layer, anthropogenic layer of the soil. And one of the uses of lead has been in paint. And the US has had many years, over 50 years of the use of lead-based paint. In Norway, lead-based paints for residential use were banned in the 1920s. In the United States, on the other hand, we continued to have lead in paint as much as 10,000 parts per million from up to 1971, and then reduced to 600 parts per million, and finally 90 parts per million is still allowed for residential paints. That does not mean that there aren't lead-based paints in use. They're used in highway striping, they're used in various boat paints and structural paints. They're still in use today. The other substance that was used in large quantities was the use of lead in gasoline. And here we have a view of the use of lead in gasoline in the US compared to Norway. And actually Norway isn't on this chart because the amount of lead in paint was in gasoline is so limited that it doesn't really show up compared to some of the other European countries. The reason for the large amount of use of lead in gasoline had to do with the fact that we have a car culture that expanded very rapidly in the 1950s especially. And as part of this culture, it was a decision was made actually in 1950 to put lead into gasoline in the place of benzene in gasoline. Benzene was recognized as being a carcinogen, and they wanted to put something safe in gasoline, so they came up with tetraethyl lead as a substitute for benzene. And then we also had a huge amount of highway construction. It was a big boom starting in the 1950s, and the building out of highway structure throughout the country. Norway, on the other hand, supported public transit, had very little private automobile ownership over a long period of time, and they had limited road construction. They certainly have roads and cars, but they were limited through taxes, and gasoline prices were very high compared to what we are paying in the United States. So you can see by the chart that huge amounts of lead in the US. Now, just looking at the two cities, New Orleans compared to Oslo, you can see that New Orleans is you find an enormous highway construction, especially towards the interior of the city. All the highways came from the suburban areas into the center of the city. And on the other hand, when you look at an aerial view of Oslo, you don't see the same thing. There certainly are roads, and but there's an enormous amount of public transit that's taken place.
Howard, I don't think we see that slide. Maybe you can. We're still on the. I don't know if it's anyone else. I'm seeing a different slide. I'm seeing the policies regulating PB. If you're looking at a different slide.
Uh-oh. Let's see. Trying to figure this out.
Maybe you can close it and open it again and move to that slide.
Do you see this?
Yes, I see it. The map of the Superdome in Oslo.
Perfect.
Okay, good, great. Sorry. All right, so you just visually, you can see a big difference. Same size cities, but very different construction in highways and roadways. George, do you see this slide? Yes? No? Hello? Are we still on?
See it.
Yeah, I see the slide.
Okay.
It's still the map.
Okay.
Okay, good.
All right.
All right. So what we did is we set up a study looking at playground soils in Oslo versus New Orleans. And Oslo, we didn't have quite as many locations compared to New Orleans, but about the same number of soil samples. And this is just a small survey, but what is important to pay attention to is that the amount of lead being found in the soils in Oslo, if you look at the median, 25 versus 418 milligrams per kilogram, and that's about 17 times more lead being found in New Orleans soils, and that's is a pretty good indication that there's some serious problems showing up in New Orleans. The amount of lead in the outlying area of New Orleans is similar to what they see as the median within the interior. Half the samples are above 25, half are below 25 in Oslo compared to 418 above and below, 418 above and below in New Orleans, parts permitted in New Orleans. Okay, so next. What we've been doing is mapping the entire city of New Orleans. And this gives you an indication of not only the amount of lead being found in two different time periods, from 2000 to 2005, compared to 2013 and 2017. And this indicates several things. First of all, in the earlier sampling between 2000 and 2005, there were large areas of the city where there actually was there was greater than 800 milligrams per kilogram, and very highly contaminated. It's related to traffic flows through the city. But then something happened by 2013 through 2017. There's an enormous reduction that took place in the amount of lead being found in that very thin layer, the surface sample. And this turns out to have been very important to the city in terms of the exposure taking place of children. And this is an indication. I should go back and just point out that we are talking about near versus far. And the near is the area close to the downtown, the high traffic areas of the city. Far is in the outlying area. And that's the median between the two sets of samples. Oops, there we go. Whoops. Done. Okay. This is some indication of the socioeconomic consequences of the amount of lead in the soil in different parts of the city, the near and the far, for 2000 versus 2015. And you can see that the African-American population is very large percentage of people are living within the near area in 2000 compared to the far areas. So the population of white people in this city, 78% in the far area, while 72% in the near area. And the blood lead levels of the two populations, the median blood lead is almost 6 in the near area compared to 3 in the far area. And there is no known safe level of exposure to lead. In 2015, that changed. The percentage of Black people underwent a reduction to about 50%, 51% in the near area. And there was a movement of African Americans to the far area, and the far area is still predominantly white population. And if we look at the amount of exposure taking place, the far area had about twice as much lead exposure as the near area. And we also see similar types of differences within household income, far area being higher income than near area. Okay, and what does this all mean? Well, first of all, a colleague of mine, Rolf Ottesen, who recently passed, was a champion in Norway, and he was a champion in passage of Norway's Clean Soil Act. He based a lot of the ideas about a Clean Soil Act on our work that we did in New Orleans. And they applied our New Orleans data to support the act in Norway. And of course, one of the problems here was that we were the country that needed a Clean Soil Act, not Norway. Norway had relatively low amounts of lead. There certainly were some pockets of high lead, but basically much lower. And this results in some problem in that we have the wrong policies in the US compared to Norway. It's very difficult to figure out how to get a Clean Soil Act in the United States. We're not even measuring the amount of lead in soils. We have very few maps. I'm one of the people who've mapped the cities a lot. There are several other places that are being mapped or have been mapped. In the US, the consequences for excessive amounts of lead exposure include the life expectancy, learning, and behavioral issues. The Norwegian citizens excel in every one of these categories. And when we consider the primary care of the whole society in perspective, what we've established is that if we are really if we want to have a clean or a living soil fabric that is healthy and safe for children, then we have to find ways to make changes in the soil, and that living with a soil fabric is safe if you have a very high quality soil fabric, then the soil becomes, then the city becomes safe for everyone. And that is my conclusion to this survey. Thank you.